In this video, we're going to take a look at how to put the data into the React app as opposed to having it printed to the console. So what I'm going to do in this data section, I'm going to call return, and we're going to return a div element. And I'm going to copy some code in here. And this is now going to iterate through the users array that we have here. And we're going to extract the ID, the name, and the car values from the return structure. So, we have the name, we have the ID, and then we have the car. And the car is again an array of objects. So what we'll do and say, if the car length is not equal to 0, then we're going to iterate through the cars as well and get the make and the model and the color. And then we're going to put them into a new list item. And if the car length is 0, so this is the else statement, so this is a ternary if condition. Maybe you can see it better this way if I close that list of files. But we'll put no car in there. So if a user doesn't have a car, we're just going to say no car, and then we're going to return this particular list. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this and see what happens in our UI. Okay, so we get an error that says undefined is not an object. So the problem here is that data itself needs some time to gather the data itself, right? So the query goes out to the endpoint, but the way JavaScript works is that it doesn't wait for data to be populated, but it will start to say, return this div, and then iterate through the users using a map, so on and so forth. But luckily for us, we can pass in and extract additional pieces here from the query, and one is loading. So we can say something like, if loading, then return a paragraph that just says loading. So we can display a message while our GraphQL query is working, while it's retrieving the data, and until it's doing that, it's going to display the message loading. Once it's done, it's then going to return this div with the maps and the list items as well. So if we hit save, then the browser should refresh, and now what we get is a list of, I'm going to zoom in, a list of users with the cars, the make, the model, and the color of the car that they use. So this is the result of the GraphQL query placed into an application. Now, we also want to make sure that we can add a particular user, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to create yet another component. So under the source folder, I'm going to add, let's call this add user.js, which is going to be a component that will allow us to add a user. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in what is required for creating this particular component. So there's going to be an export default statement and import the React. So this is going to be a new component, and what I'm going to render is going to be a form. Now, via the form, we want to also achieve mutation, right? Because that's the key term that we want to do. So I'm going to bring in some additional things in here. So mutation from React Apollo is going to be 1. And what I will do here as well before working on the component is create an add user variable where I'm going to specify the actual mutation itself. So this will be a mutation, and I'm going to call this make user, and we're going to use $name, which is going to be a variable that we can use. So mutation make user will have a variable of name, which needs to be a string, and I'm going to say make user name, and then pass in the variable that we passed into here. So this mutation works in exactly the same way that we saw it during the examples with the playground. So this is now going to essentially take the ID, the name, and let's return something else for the car as well, like the make. Okay, so far so good. So what we're going to do is now build up the actual add user component, and we're going to use the state, and we're going to set the state of the name to be actually an empty value. And then I'm going to have to create, of course, a render function which should return something. So for now, what I'm going to return is going to be a very simple form, which I'm going to copy from something that I wrote earlier, just to save some time. And let's just remove these things from this form. Okay, so as you can see, this form on submission calls two things. It calls make user and this reset fields. So what I need to do is first of all call reset fields. So let's write reset fields. This is going to be a very simple function that is going to call this set state, and it's going to set the state of the name back to an empty value. Okay, so this is just making sure that once the form has submitted, the actual name value is cleared. And let's then also take a look at here. So if someone is changing the name input field, we want to call this name changed. So that's something that we also need to write. So name changed. And in there we have access to the target event that has a value property. So this is going to be the actual input box value. And then I'm going to set the state of name and value. Okay, so let's save this. And we can probably go ahead and test this. So let's go back to user and say import add user from add user. And let's add this new component here. And let's have a horizontal ruler to separate the add user and the user. Okay, so we have make user that is not defined in here. Actually, we can just cut this just to make sure that everything works. Okay, so we have the name label, the input box, and the add user button, but this is not going to do anything for now. Because what we need to do is do the actual mutation, right? So first of all, on submission, we need to call this make user mutation that we created. So this is what we have here, that requires us to pass in a name, which is a string. So what we pass in, and this is how you work with variables in the React Apollo library. So we basically say variables, and then we specify as an object the variable properties and the values that we want to send in to the make user function. So in this case, we want to take the name, which we store on the state of this component. So this the state of name is equal to name. So name here is the actual variable that we use here, and then that gets passed on to make user there. So how do we actually make the mutation? Because so far we have just the form, but remember we did import this mutation here from React Apollo. So that's an actual component. So we're going to wrap this entire form into this mutation element. So let's go here, here, and then there. Okay, so this is going to be part of our mutation. So for the mutation, we need to pass in a mutation attribute, which is going to be the mutation function of add user. And we're going to do some additional things in here. I'm going to add something called refresh queries. So refresh queries is an array of objects with a query, and this is going to say once the mutation is completed, i.e. once we inserted a new user to the database in our case, then refresh the data set and apply this query. And what is this query? Remember, this is the same query that we use to list these users there. So essentially what this will do is that after the mutation has successfully been completed, it is going to run the query again, and then we will see the new user added here. Okay, that's great. And I'm going to add yet another value here, which is await refresh queries. So await refresh queries is a Boolean attribute, so it's either true or false. So true means that while we're adding the new user, it should display a loading message, which we'll add in just a second, but the loading message should go away once the mutation has completed and once the refresh query has completed as well. This is just providing the users with a better user experience. Right, so then we have this mutation, and then we can access the result of the mutation. So make user is what we need to call, and then we can access things like loading and even an error that is provided to us automatically by this React Apollo thing. And let's open a parenthesis. In there we have the form, so we call the actual make user, and towards the end of the form let's also print out loading, and this should say adding, or let's say adding user. And let's also do, should we have an error, then let's in a paragraph just display the error message itself, so or just say error, so that an error happened. Okay, so then we close this. Actually, I put this into the wrong place. This should come right here. Then we close that, and then we have the mutation closing tag as well. Okay, so hopefully this is now going to work. Let's save this. Wait for the browser to refresh. Okay, so we have the browser now refreshed, and let's add a new user. Okay, so we had add user, we had a loading message that says adding user. I don't know if you managed to catch that. And now we have the refresh done, and we have an updated list of users here, which includes Joe, that of course does not have a car because we haven't accommodated for that scenario. Now, there's no sort of magic way to add a car as well, so you would have to build up the form on your own and say add the username, add the make and the model and the color of the car, and then make sure that the mutation is called for make car as well, and then you would have to find some ways to link between the user and the car, right? So there's no easy way of doing that. There's no silver bullet that would do that for you in React using the React Apollo library, but there are ways that you can do that. But in this video we're going to stop here, and then we're going to continue with a different section on GraphQL. I just wanted to show you that it's possible to consume GraphQL using a very simple example using React.